since a few years, actually, I will show you on the slide my first inspiration to deal with sociolinguistics of writing systems, and especially what can be called ethnolinguistic identities. And not only writing systems as such, but also scripts. Well, obviously my stay in in Japan contributed to my vision of different identities behind different scripts, but also all the orthographic disputes. And since I'm also, well, since 2 years I'm a student of Latvian philology, and in the history of the Latvian language, there was a very important debate on fonts, type fonts. So all the visual aspects of how to render linguistic language messages and yeah. So the question of, I prepared quite wordy slides because I thought that there would be an interpreter. So I know it's always easier to read, but well, if you don't mind, we'll have these well, short texts. So we, as Westerners, of course, quite a colonial notion, but since the rise of European nationalism, we do still, in large part, judge languages, but whether they are written, and if they are written, whether they are standardized. You know? So that as the colonial era came to an end across much of the world in the 60s, that tendency also interfered with the rising development impulse. What would be the place of the local languages all over the world in educational and political projects of the post-colonial states across the globe? But before this, those disputes on standardization, literacy, writing systems and writing identities really contributed to quite many ideas, quite many tendencies. And well, actually now we still also witness that flourishing development of orthographies for a large number of languages. So as I mentioned, it has been even strengthened with that worldwide wave of language revival. The language revival, however, is still often directly associated with the standardization of its written form. So linguists have generally claimed that script is something that does not belong to language. So Ferdinand de Saussure, if you know the history of linguistics, really rejected writing as an interesting, as an aspect of language, potentially interesting for linguists. So it was supposed to be something secondary, rather left to culture scientists, historians. But even those sociolinguists who have dealt with those interrelations between script, writing system, orthographies from one side, and the communities of users and speech communities from the other side, claim that the former, the scripts, are fundamentally independent of languages, which is absolutely, well, which can be discussed, but absolutely they are not free, they are not independent of language ideologies. Okay, well, one of the most salient examples being, for example, Urdu, written either in Arabic or in Devanagari, but behind it there's the whole load of political, ethnic, social history of the Indian subcontinent. So scripts by their users are intrinsically related to their languages. So they are demonstration, manifestation of identity, also linguistic identity. That's the result of the obviously visible character of writing and perceptible symbolic values. What we can see, what we see is more persuasive than what we hear, what we think of. So written form of languages are perceived usually as a symbol of higher, if not just high prestige, carrier of community values in space, in time. When we talk about the standardization, we often mean what is called language purity. So this statement by language planners in their pursuit for language purity is quite well understandable, or we know what is meant with respect to lexicon, orthography, grammar. So there's what is sought for is a substantive language planning model, which rejects influence, usually, from outside languages. What would it mean in writing? So in written, printed, displayed form of language, it's almost impossible to preserve a graphic purity, because otherwise any variety considered a language should have an own writing. Well, developing a written form of a language variety involves then not only a simple selection of appropriate orthography, so set of rules, but also what stands behind it, making decisions concerning cultural, religious, political, historical matters, sometimes geographical, social, and so on. So traditional script or scriptal layout has been ideologically related with culture, even more often in the history of mankind, with religion. So when we see Cyrillic script, we somehow automatically, spontaneously associate it with the Christian Eastern Orthodoxy. Probably from the Greek perspective it's not so obvious, but from Central European it's quite unique, it's quite meaningful. So Arabic is of course connected with Islamic tradition, and so on. Latin with Westerners, Chinese characters with the East Asian cultural circle. On the other hand, those scripts designed purposely for individual languages have a more national cultural mode. So you probably saw the beautiful scripts invented just for one language, but with time they also became sort of scriptal invaders of our languages, usually like causing a vicious circle of argumentation that if a language, if a variety belongs to the same cultural circle, it should be written with the same script. If it is written with the same script, then it is considered a dialect of the language. Well, Georgian, Armenian, Korean, or Japanese being good examples in that respect. Well, however, in any case, like with language revitalization, like with all the actions undertaken within and with and for language communities, this is the community who should have a decisive voice when adopting strict writing system orthography. So now, well, some of my considerations about case studies. That's what I discussed with Olympia. I wouldn't like I don't like to be prescriptive. It will be more descriptive and case study review sort of. Yeah. So of particular significance are publicly visible elements of a minority language, which symbolically mark the community territory within the area of the dominant language. This is the graphic marking. So for the latter, for the dominant language, the written language plays simply a communicative role, also sometimes ideological and symbolic, but first of all, in the case of the dominated languages, it's usually more ideological and symbolic than communicative. So place names, all the names of settlements, municipalities, other toponyms are displayed in 2 or more languages, including the local, less privileged, or in languages which are considered rival to the dominant language. That rivalry is even more remarkable if the names are written differently, with different scripts, different fonts, or they use graphemes, letters, which are considered typical for just one of the languages. So not infrequent are cases when the name in one language is either removed or painted over as a visible sign of an ethnolinguistic conflict. Well, it's the beginning of the years 2010, 2011, I was quite proud, happy to see my monolingual, monocultural country like enriching its language landscape with very scarce but very, very visible place names, bilingual place names. Here I've chosen a name in Lemko, Rusin language. Well, actually only 7 villages decided to use bilingual names. Well, it was the year 2011. We all were quite happy. We celebrated it together with the community, just to see a few years later, well, like a return to monoscriptalism, because I treat it not as not so much as well, interpretations might be different, but it's the same place name within 6 years. So then we have also ethnic fonts, quite an interesting phenomenon. Some minority language communities prefer to use a special font, as the Basque, Hari or Vaska, or historical Gaelic script, Clogela, for the Celtic languages. Well, the scriptal features became a relevant, symbolically distinctive markers of linguistic landscape. The Basque script is even used for for longer texts. Yeah? There's the whole graphic font prepared, and well, the objective of the aim of using this is to make a Basque text recognizable immediately, not only by some linguistic phenomena, but graphically. So this is also a way of using the same writing system, but just a different type font. Oh, sorry. Or, well, Irish, which somehow, well, I tried to find a text, non-Irish text written with Clogalic. It's quite difficult, but, well, what I found is actually a proof that fonts could differentiate languages symbolically, like in that old sort of vocabulary, comparing Irish, Latin, and English. If you look thoroughly, you see the fonts are language specific in these cases. Well, then what sometimes, the next case study I'd like to comment on is a very important role, very symbolic role of what we call in Central Europe Gothic script. Yeah, well, we might, it might be black letter, it might be bastard, but generally we call it Gothic letter. And well, for a speaker of a Slavic language, it's actually quite surprising to see a Slavic text printed with Gothic letters. After a short analysis, it appears it's not standard Polish. Well, as a matter of fact, this book, printed in the year 1900, proved to be the only book ever printed in what is presently referred to as the Mazurian dialect. Again, this discussion of language and dialect. Let's have a look on on other inspirations of the Gothic script. Well, sometimes the use of a different font, it's of course, here it's of course hardly a linguistic feature, but we can see how Gothication of script makes or inspires the reader to interpret it in a, well, we could discuss which way. It's a label of the Russian vodka, where Cyrillic is used with Gothic letters. For example, Japanese katakana, which, well, here you have the katakana you usually use if you are a user of the Japanese script. But, well, actually, when in Japan I also discovered that font. Well, when asking what's behind this, or for example, when finding such a restaurant in northern Japan, restaurant Gototen, well, here it's some wordplay because they associate this with also Gothic, but the name is simply Japanese. Well, in each of these cases where you can find the Gothic letters, the ideology behind it is different. So for the Japanese, Gothic script means something chic, Western. So you can expect some good European food behind this script. Well, this is an everyday usage, so somehow historical. In the old town of Vienna, most of the streets are labeled with what we call Gothic script. But then in the same country of Austria, I found a election announcement, which is, well, go to vote because the others do it also. So obviously here the ideological load is the strongest. It's actually understood as do vote because the extreme rightists do it as well. So you can see the same sort of scriptal symbols carrying completely different neutral or very heavily political meaning. So now I'd like to quote a fantastic monograph on digraphia by scriptality. So where there are more than where there is more than one system, one graphic system, competing standards and orthographies. The choice of writing system or the choice to combine elements of available writing systems simultaneously acknowledges parallel symbolic systems and sets of graphemes, of letters, that can represent the linguistic segment in question and highlights the ideological layers of meaning. Okay, so now, as I promised, this was actually the first time I somehow got confronted with that ideological, as I thought, load in the scriptural aspect, this time type font. Well, in the history of Polish literature, there's a very important guy, Mr. Wicherkiewicz, a Nobel Prize winner, who in partition Poland took the role of recreating a great national history, to write books referring to the great Polish past, and actually in conflict, any of the volumes, any of the novels presented an ethnic conflict, the beginnings of ethnic conflicts with most our neighbors. When I saw the book, I thought, okay, a nice joke. Krzyżacy means the German Teutonic Knights. I thought, okay, because it is about this Germanic power confronting our Slavic great history, it is written with the Gothic letters. But then I read, everything is in Polish. Polish orthography. Well, the normal book cover, normal, everyday book cover seen by a Polish reader looks more or less like this. Antiqua, typical Latin letters. What stood behind this? Then I looked at the place of issue, the place of publication. It's Olsztyn. This was the biggest town of Eastern Prussia, German territory in 1930. It turned to be a Polish book printed for the local Polish-speaking community, Mazurians, who were Protestant, and as being Protestant, they didn't use Latin Antiqua at all. In order to propagate the Polish history among what was supposed to become a full-fledged Polish minority, but at the time being this was a Polish-speaking Protestant minority of Eastern Prussia, the book was published in the graphic system type font, accessible and acceptable for the local Slavic population. As you can witness, there's a bloom of Little Prince editions. Everybody heard about recent publications. Well, in case of the more or less language area of Poland, we recently had Lenko-Rusin edition, Kashubian, Silesian, even the Urbalect of my native Poznan, a very interesting publication in Warsaw Yiddish, as you can see in Latin letters, not in Hebrew. More and more books in Yiddish are published in Latin letters because Hebrew is, well, from one side, is not so much well known. On the other side, it has also more and more ideological load of the Hebrew language. But the most interesting in that case was a recent translation of Little Prince into Masurian. So they decided to mark it visibly again with Gothic letters to make it culturally belonging to that past when Masurians, Protestant Masurians, made use only of the Gothic letters. Well, as you can guess, this slide was added very recently, before I had that. And well, thanks to the excursion to Galiciano, I found exactly what I meant, a missing slide. So a case, well, especially this, yes, here you have Greek, but, well, typographic Hellenization of an otherwise Latin scripted text. So this is obviously the same cultural identity, marker of cultural identity, and as such, well, if looked from far, it simply makes a whole, and it's quite understandable. Well, not as a linguistic message, but as a cultural, historical, ethnopolitical message to the reader. Well, then you have very salient cases of love, attraction, affection attributed to some ethnic letters, especially Eastern Europe recently, and the recent decade, witnessed such demonstrations of graphic identity. So the first monument dedicated to a letter was built in Ukrainian Rivne, and well, to a letter considered the most Ukrainian of the Ukrainian alphabet, E with 2 dots. Well, just next year, Belarusians decided to commemorate their W letter with a monument in the city of Polotsk. Well, I think that not only cultural values, but also sort of linguistic self-confidence of the two Eastern Slavic speech communities vis-à-vis historically, politically, and demographically dominant Russian was symbolized in the monument. Well, a year later, the Russians decided to build a monument to the letter Yo. Well, this in Ulyanovsk. It's actually not so much linguistic, ethno-linguistic identity as a symbol of important role of these 2 dots. Because Russians, usually when writing or printing, they do not use them. Everybody, every speaker of Russian knows where Yo and Ye, it should be pronounced Yo. So it's mostly for foreigners in textbooks, but it is also a marker of Russian linguistic identity. And since the letter itself, not the alphabet, not the script, not the language, but the letter is endangered, Russians decided to erect a monument. Well, at the end of the same year, the Komi, an endangered minority language, Uralic, decided to erect a letter to, well, it's not all umlaut, it's diarrhea, all very symbolic for the Komi language. So all over the former Soviet Union you can find monuments to letters, like a whole complex of letters in the Armenian landscape devoted to the beautiful script, which is also one of the markers of Armenian national linguistic pride, can be found in Armenia. Sorry. Well, all over Croatia, more and more memorials do commemorate Glagolica, considered the only truly original Slavic script, none like the Greek, Cyrillic, or Latin alphabets. This is the true Slavic. So many Croats really demonstrate, manifest their respect, and promote Glagolitic inscriptions as a direct expression of the Croatian search for a visibly markable identity which could stronger distinguish them from neighboring language and nations. If a language community uses the same script as the surrounding dominant languages, it is individual graphemes or letters or even individual diacritic signs that might become ideological carriers and visible indices of identity. Well, from Central Europe again, this letter, if a Kashub see Shva, it's immediately recognizable. The text, the whole word must be Kashubian. The same for the letter E in Lithuanian, or in our beloved Vimeserish, they also now have the only, the unique marker of Vimeserishness. I found it quite an interesting and humorous case of the letter Q, used for southern Estonian variety of Viro, as contrasted to northern Estonian standard, and especially the two D, K, which is unpronounced, it's a glottal stop in this case, do mark plural. So in the north you have D, and then in the south you have as an almost mirror image of the same letter. So letters can also be played with as symbols of identity. Well, the long O, Latgalian, it is a political question. It's a question of identity. It was officially outlawed by the Latvian language authorities. Just to remind you, Latgale is here in Eastern Latvia. Well, this letter is meant not to correspond with the general Latvian graphic tradition. So as such, is not particularly welcome. Well, Ukrainian good. Actually, it was forbidden. A letter was forbidden by the Soviet orthographic reforms in the 1930s as too much Western and too little Soviet. I mentioned the E for Lithuanian. What Lithuanians themselves think about the letter. So most of the diacritic letters of the Lithuanian alphabet are borrowed from other nations. Okay, there's no purity as such. The 32 letters of the Lithuanian alphabet reveal the history of the country perfectly. So Russian, German, and so on influences. Only one letter is exclusively ours. It has no analog in the world. So we, Lithuanians, we do need a graphic marker of identity. Well, of course, there might be accents, diareses, tildes, currents. They often become iconic of particular orthographies. I bet if you see two dots, you immediately think of German umlauts, which is absolutely right, but not uniquely. Well, letters may happen to be carriers, not so much of group ideologies, but individual language attitudes. So it was the case of the letter allegedly hated by a prominent Polish communist politician as a marker of Ukrainianness. Yeah. So as a result of that letter hatred in '77, many names of villages in southeastern Poland were changed, especially those which contained They were too Ukrainian and not enough Polish. Well, actually, the whole language, the whole script can become victims of language policies. Well, this is quite an interesting case after the fall of the so-called Polish uprising of January 1863-64. The Russian authorities wanted Polish to be written with Cyrillics. A few books were printed at that time, like even the grammar of the Polish language, with all Polish diacritics, but the entirety printed in Cyrillics. Well, what was just an experiment in case of Polish, in case of Lithuanian, was a 40-year-long ban on anything Latin. So it was the Russian authorities imposed Lithuanian publications in Cyrillic. What was the reaction? A terrific national response and the largest book smuggling movement in history. Actually, UNESCO recognized Knygnieszai, book carriers, book smugglers, as a part of the world cultural heritage. Who provided the Latin written Lithuanian texts? The Germans in East Prussia. But also, well, this was an occasion to impose Gothic script of Latin as more Latin to Lithuanians who opposed the Cyrillic version of their native language. Okay, individual letters are still being discussed. For example, there's a big discussion within the Lenko-Rusin community whether or not to use a letter which visually differentiates Lenko from Ukrainian, but at the same time it makes it closer to Russian. Individual letters can be considered sacred, like the letter Yat. If you see the cross here, you understand why it still survives in liturgical church texts written in Russian Church Slavonic. It has recently found also favor in advertising religious matters, but well, as the users of Lenko language say, the letter is the most beautiful among Slavic letters. It's a cross, so the text looks beautiful and sacred. It's Christ's enemies who rose their hand against the letter. After the anti-Christian revolution in Russia, the first thing the communists, the Bolsheviks did, and Freemasons, was to throw away the yak. For the Russian sake, the yak has survived in our Russian Orthodoxy. As long as the Russians exist, the yak shall exist in all Church Slavonic. Well, these are two last slides. I'd like to sum up by a quotation from, well, I'm talking about the Lenko-Rusin community, a letter sent by a little boy, a Lenko-Rusin reader of the Besida journal, who asked for publishing Russian text in the Polish alphabet, so he could more understand, he could read Russian with more ease. Well, we have to remember that in the communist times, Cyrillics had been used for teaching Russians. Nowadays, in Poland, it's discardable and almost forgotten. But the editor of the journal, Petro Dorfanowski, answered, "Our script can be learned in a few days, dear Pavlo. Language constitutes a nation's soul, while the writing is a little box where the soul resides. In another box, the soul would die. Wouldn't you feel sorry, Pavlo?" Okay, no, that's it.
In the afternoon we have a presentation on the two alphabets, Latin and Greek, so you put both there. It's fantastic. Guys, question, comments, curiosities?
Too much clear.
Yeah, I have another nice example perhaps, so you might familiar around the letter H. in the Basque country, it's a source of almost war between north and south. And of course, then it's also linked to whether you pronounce it or not. So, but it's an enormous identity marker at this stage.
Do we have Galician? When in Galicia, it's quite a political issue whether the name of Galicia is written with Z Galita or SI Galicia. Yeah, well, these are or even the pronunciation is almost the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I also was noticing, that it's always very much linked to politics.
Ideology.
Ideology and
I think scripts generally are much more ideological than spoken languages. Languages.
I would like to add a similar example, not for the Greek script, the contrast between the monotonic and the polytonic writing system, which is not about the script, but the accentuation, or not the ancient method of marking stress or not, and it's still causing a huge debate in Greece because the more conservative, right-wing, religious still prefer to use it, and there are articles that say you killed our language when you changed the accentuation system.
So you killed the language by removing the accents, or by adding?
By removing the old accentuation system.
Can it be somehow parallel to Katharevousa demotic?
Yes, yes. The Katharevousa, the demotiki was implemented by law in 76, and the new accent system in 1992.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's even more than diacritics because it's like a prosodic issue.
It's just orthography, it doesn't mean anything because there's only one stress accent in Greek. The other accents are just for show.
Okay, so it's like the case of Russian yo.
Yes.
It's there to show the Russianness.
And also I would like to say that sometimes there are practical issues involved, not only ideological matters, because sometimes the writing system doesn't have a specific grapheme in order to represent a sound that variety, dialect or language or whatever you want to call it. For example, if we want to use the Greek alphabet to write all the dialectal varieties of Greek, they have sounds like sh and ch, and that cannot be written with the Greek alphabet.
Well, everything can be written with everything, but okay, the first choice, I can bet, or probably it's almost a rule. Somebody proposes a symbol, which is more or less after linguistic analysis, but then the first reactions are obviously ideological. No, it's not ours. No, it's too Slavic. No, it's too something. Or it's...
Also, in the computer age that we live, it's always better to have letters with as few diacritics as possible, because then they are not Unicode, and then they're not machine readable, and then it's harder to write them on your mobile when you chat.
It's relative. It's relative. As a Vietnamese, a single letter, Vietnamese letter, can have up to 4 diacritics. And they use it. And this is a strong national language with, I am sure, quite a developed digital, underworld.
Yeah, I was actually wondering whether you have looked at Facebook and social media in general, because I think there is a lot of discussion there too on how to write minority languages, because also sometimes they have a system which has been standardized by someone, either an academic or someone from the community, but then it's not really in use in the community. And then when people started writing a lot on Facebook, which wasn't the case in the past, then you see lots of other graphemes being used, coming up, discussed in communities.
Osiris wanted to... I have one brief remark and then a brief question. For example, I want to know the relationship between writing and power related with law. For example, in Mexico, the vast majority of indigenous customary law are based in oral tradition, and the official law in the constitution, for example, is in a writing system. And it's very, very common, doesn't take into account the customary law based in oral traditions, and of course, the writing law has a privilege. What do you think about it? About this relation between writing and power? But it's not useful because a lot of people are not able to understand, for example, this written text, and by the reason, for example, the lack of knowledge of this international regulation. What do you think about the relationship between writing systems and power, ideological political power, in contrast with oral tradition and customary law?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely a crucial issue. I think that a few studies have been written. It's more not the scriptal aspect, but writing per se, and the problem of literacy. So literacy and society, and literacy and access, for example, to equal rights. I think that, one of the first books I remember I read about this was Writing in Society by Florian Pullmans, and actually I was I was disappointed because he exactly addressed those issues, and I don't feel so competent in this is more like ethnolinguistic part of legal linguistics.
Legal linguistics.
Legal linguistics, yeah. So how to transfer some legal concepts, some cultural concepts into not only different ethno-linguistic systems, but systems which don't, or structures which don't make use of the same carrier of the meaning. So what I can think of is the Chinese system where the ideograms, characters were made actually so popular, and there was no, in the Chinese context, one could hardly say about illiteracy, but the original pictorial characters were carriers of some imposed cultural values, legal values, and then even if read differently in different languages or whatever dialects, they convey the same top-down cultural, legal, political, scientific concepts. So this is a different. Well, I don't think I can find a solution. I know too little about this symbol, but it's a very important question, and it's more on the societal role of literacy, cultural literacy.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that what Osiris is referring is actually quite unusual in the context that you're talking about, right? So you're looking at, because it's about not just diglossia in the strict linguistic sense, but about legal diglossia and epistemological diglossia, if you want, no? And in the sense that it seems it seems like a discussion, and very interesting discussion that you presented here about the political importance of script. In the case of the indigenous Americas, there's this added discussion. I mean, there's
Absolutely, yeah. It's like a new chapter.
Yeah, exactly.
To all this.
Precisely because here, it seems like the written word carries not just. I mean, it's an important means of solving different societal issues, right?
Yeah.
So everybody, for the most part, accepts that the written word carries with it, or it must be used. So the discussion focuses on what is the script that we're going to use,
Yes.
right? And not if we are going to use a script.
Script,
right?
yeah.
That's a given, right? The script must be used because it has always been used by the powers that be, right? But in the case of Mexico, there's this, very striking difference between the modern laws imposed on indigenous societies and the way in which indigenous societies generally solve issues where the spoken word is more important, especially when discussing legal matters or trying to solve conflicts or whatever. Right? So that's the main difference, I think, that between this context.
Of course, I agree. It's like another chapter
Yes.
of the story.
Okay.
Any other comment, question? Then, join me. Thank you.